All right. Hello and welcome to our scholar session this evening. I'm Lacey, the membership coordinator at President Lincoln's Cottage. I want to say thank you for joining us here tonight, particularly our Team Lincoln members. Your annual gifts help preserve the cottage and you make programs like this possible. In addition to supporting our mission, members receive a variety of benefits, such as discounted tour tickets, early access to special events, programs, discounts at our museum shop, and more. If you're not already a member or you need to renew your membership, you can do so online at lincolncottage.org/membership. I'm going to turn it over now to our CEO and Executive Director, Callie Hawkins.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Lacey. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We're so delighted to have you. It's a delight to see some new names and also some familiar ones. So whether you're joining us for the first time or the 50th time for this program, we're delighted to have you. It is my honor to welcome tonight our featured speaker, Dr. Stephen A. Goldman. Dr. Goldman is a psychiatrist with decades of experience in academic and clinical medicine and also public health. He is also an international consultant in medical product safety. Linking experience treating and working with combat veterans with in-depth study of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and race, his thought-provoking findings have been welcomed on television, radio, podcasts, and other speaking venues. The only physician to serve on the Abraham Lincoln Institute Board of Directors and a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, he recently published One More War to Fight: Union Veterans Battle for Equality Through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Lost Cause. Dr. Goldman has served as an adjunct assistant professor of psychiatry at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences and is currently an adjunct professor at Shepherd University, where he teaches seminar in the honors program. I know his conversation with us tonight is going to be really illuminating, and so I'm delighted to welcome you here, Dr. Goldman. One note that I will add is that we would love for you to add any questions that you might have throughout the conversation in the chat at the bottom of your screen. You can type those in. We will have some opportunity for Q&A at the end of the program. So feel free, as he says something really thought-provoking, feel free to make note of that in the chat, and we'll go through those at the end. We'll also give you an opportunity at the end to share whatever else you might want to. So without further ado, Dr. Goldman, I will turn the floor over to you.
Well, thanks, Callie. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to try and keep to a limit so we have about 15 minutes of Q&A. I always like to start off with a quote. And this is from a gentleman I greatly admired who I never got a chance to meet. After 40 years, it is almost hard to remember myself whole. I've had this body for much longer than I had the original one. But seeing those young men in the DNZ in Korea reminded me that I was still a soldier at heart. The same sense of duty and love of country that drove me towards military service coursed through these men as well. That was Captain Max Cleland of the U.S. Army, a Silver and Bronze Star awardee, former administrator of the VA, and a Democratic senator from Georgia, and a triple amputee. In my new book, I tell two intertwined, previously untold stories. How Northern veterans, black and white, fought a second war seeking equality for all Americans, and the process created a model of civic commitment based on military service that American citizen soldiers like Max Cleland, sailors and Marines have emulated in modern times. Now, in all of my work, including the book that I published recently, I utilized the unique lifelong study of a national cohort of white Union soldiers and sailors. What happened was that in the war's immediate aftermath, starting in mid-1865 through early 1866, about 270 battle-hardened Northern veterans, 98% of whom had entered the service as enlisted personnel and lost the use of their right arms, they responded to a nationwide handwriting contest where they were asked for a sample to show that they were using their left hands. They were all right-handed. And all they were asked for was to talk about patriotic themes. They ended up submitting the damnedest essays you've ever saw. Astounding essays indicative of their perception about having gone to war, their pride of accomplishment, and what they had learned from going to war. And when I first started looking at this material at the Library of Congress, asked for by a close friend of mine, Dr. John Sellers, I decided I wanted to track down all the men, all 268, which entailed my going over to their pension records at National Archives, which frankly was a great advantage to me because those are medical records. So I was not only finding out all about what happened to these men for the rest of their lives, I was also taking a look at the history of medicine up until 1937 when the last man died. Now, the reason why I was using that material is, as an epidemiologist, I wanted to see if the left arm corps was a representative sample of white Northern soldiers, because the sample had been selected because they were the men who had submitted the handwriting contest submissions. And to make a very long story short, it is the most unique national sample of early enlistees, 1861, 1862, white Northern enlistees, 98% of whom were enlisted men, not officers, that exists. They were exceedingly representative of the common Northern soldier. Now, while I use that as a validated typical cohort of white Union veterans, there are two free men of color within the cohort. One of them is Robert Pinn. The other is William Hannibal Thomas, both of whom were Ohioans, both free men of color, both of whom had fought with the 5th United States Colored Troops, and both of them sergeants. Now, to make it abundantly clear, I don't just use this sample. I use this as a representative sample to look at Union veterans in toto, but I do use a representative sample as a way of testing hypotheses. Now, the thing that is critical to remember about the Civil War is that the Civil War was as ideologic a conflict as one can imagine. And the Union soldier was instrumental for two war aims. The initial war aim was to preserve the Republic. The second war aim, which raised the war to another moral level, was the destruction of slavery. And those two things, for both of which the Union soldier, white and black, was intimately responsible for. And more than the average civilian, they realized that what lay ahead after the Civil War, what Lincoln called the unfinished work in the Gettysburg Address, was not freedom. The unfinished work was equality. And in many ways, it still remains an unfinished work, although we've certainly made tremendous strides. And the unfinished work itself promised to be as bitter, divisive, and perilous as the war itself, if not more so. That's why I called it One More War to Fight in my book. Now, along with this, and again, I've been privileged to have worked with our fellow citizens who have been to war, and in many cases have been in combat. When you go to war, it is life-changing, irrevocably changed by all you see, do, and accomplish. And the Union soldier, the foot soldier, the grunt, which frankly is my emphasis, it's not surprising that a sizable proportion of the citizen servicemen from the North have been politically radicalized. Now, the question is, would white and black Northern veterans maintain the dedication to the causes for which they battled and bled and continue the struggle for freedom and opportunity for all Americans? Would the special barrier-shattering brotherhood that forms among those who have risked everything together continue in the absence of war? And bear in mind, the use of African-American troops, which, by the way, was not unique to the Civil War. By the end of the Revolutionary War, up to 10% of the army, the Revolutionary Army, was actually composed of African-Americans. But so percentage-wise, that's almost exactly the match in the Civil War. Of course, the numbers were much greater because there were many more men who served in the armies and they visited the Union than served in the Revolutionary War. But the point is, they served together, even though the units were segregated. So the question that I try to answer, and I do answer in my book, is that they did remain true to what they had fought for. They remained true for what they had to fight during peacetime, and that is an emphatic yes. Now, the left arm corps, again, the representative sample that I've been studying, they typify all white and black Union veterans who used the gift and onus of survival. Now, why do I say that? You probably heard about survivor guilt. Survivor guilt generally morphs into something called survivor obligation, where if you are fortunate enough to survive war, you have two obligations. You have an obligation to those who did not survive. You also have an obligation to continue the work that the war was involved with. That's why when you fight a war, why you fought the war is just as important, if not even more important, after the war than it was during the war. And there's also something else about being in combat, being part of an army, being part of the government, is being part of something larger than yourself. And as Abraham Lincoln talked about the United States system of government, the last best hope of earth. Now, the Union soldier, the Union volunteer, had a great identity as a citizen soldier. And that meant a lot to them. And Abraham Lincoln recognized that. And in the first message to Congress on July 4th, 1861, he pointed out that in single regiments, that there were members who had, as he put it, full practical knowledge of all the arts, sciences, professions, whatever else known in the world. And there's scarcely one of a regiment that you could not select a president, a cabinet, a Congress, perhaps a court, competent to administer the government itself. This is very prescient. As you know, several of the presidents that came after Lincoln and after Andrew Johnson were Union veterans. Now, the meaning of being a citizen soldier was very special to Union servicemen. They were fighting both for themselves and for their country, and their self-respect was typified by 6th Pennsylvania Cavalryman Sergeant Louis Booz. He'd been paroled after 5 weeks of captivity, and as the ship was coming into harbor, he sees dozens of more star-spangled banners floating triumphantly from the peaks of steamers. The poor released prisoners could be restrained no longer, giving 3 long continued cheers for that flag which protects the home of the free and the brave. I felt proud I was an American citizen, and that I was in the ranks of its armies. So the appreciation for valor, pride of being a U.S. volunteer soldier, and the terrible cost of that service was brilliantly captured by Captain Charles A. Stevens, historian of one of the elite units of the Civil War, that was Badam's U.S. sharpshooters. They were coming back from the hard fight at Chancellorsville in May 1863, and they were an elite group. Then they saw another elite outfit. As he wrote, the Great Western or Iron Brigade, looking like giants with their tall hats. Those are the Hardee hats. And as with the custom, they paid tribute to the Iron Brigade. But the sharpshooters knew something more about what it meant to be an elite unit. Quote, cold lead brought down the best of men. And of that entire brigade and all its just pride, a few weeks were destined to pass, their decimated ranks proving too truthfully that even they were not invulnerable. If you're familiar with Gettysburg, the Iron Brigade essentially disappeared to all intents and purposes during the destructive Battle of Gettysburg, in which they were led by another great citizen soldier. The 6th Wisconsin was led by Rufus Dawes. Now, across time, Stevens' eloquence, honor, and pain endure. Quote, when I look back and see that famed body of troops marching up that long, muddy hill, unmindful of the rain, full of life and spirit, steady step, filling the entire roadway, and I remember how soon they would be swept away by bullets and shell, the pride of looking upon a model American volunteer, which they truly represented, turns now to utter sadness at what hard fate befell them in the next battle. The Left Arm Corps, like all Union citizen soldiers, knew that there was something new in history, because the concept of being a citizen soldier made them very different than other soldiers in their time. And again, this is one of the essays that was submitted for the handwriting contest. This is Corporal Richard Miles, 148th Pennsylvania. He talked about that a nation which founds its claims to a military reputation is on the intelligence of the citizen soldiers. And he felt they achieved something more than that martial renown. It proves its invincible power and ability to fight for self-defense, as well as establishes the highest faculty for self-government. All these truths have been shown in the late Civil War. No less insightful was Major Joseph Wiley Galbraith of the 4th Massachusetts Heavy Artillery, who felt that the soldiers of the North exemplified something different than other armies, particularly in Europe. He said, they feel and know that they are properties of their sovereign. They have little to say in the affairs of their government, naturally feel themselves non-responsible for its errors and mistakes. The great majority of the men compromising large standing armies in Europe have lose their individuality, become parts of one stupendous whole, guided and controlled like a vast machine by its officers or its only thinking men. Now, Galbraith was from England, and he felt that the professional armies in Europe went to war, quote, without a thought of the justice of the cause and fight, as well as the interests of their country, because their fellow citizens did not go to war. That was very different in the United States, as he put it, because nothing of the horrors of war touched those who did not fight the war. In the United States, that was entirely different. At the first sound of war's stern alarms, patriotism demands we not only loosen our purse strings, but that all of us, no matter what our business may be, shall leave it and join the ranks of a citizen soldiery. The Union soldier is not a machine, but a living, breathing, thinking patriot. 2 decades later, his former commander, the Supreme Commander, Ulysses S. Grant, echoed those very thoughts. The armies of Europe are machines. The men are brave, the officers capable, but the majority of the soldiers, most of those nations, are taken from a class of people who are not very intelligent and who have very little interest in the contests in which they are called upon to take part. Our armies are composed of men who are able to read, men who knew what they were fighting for, and could not be induced to serve as soldiers except in an emergency. And so necessarily must have been more than equal to men who fought merely because they were brave and because they were thoroughly drilled and inured to hardships. Now, the psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, a contemporary of mine, who specialized in treating Vietnam vets, has noted that, quote, any army, ancient or modern, is a social construction defined by shared expectations and values, and that those things are vital to any army, and they also comprise the moral world that soldiers for the most part accept. Shea concluded in one of his marvelous books, the moral power of an army is so great that it can motivate men to get up out of a trench and step into enemy machine gun fire, or in the case of the Civil War, storm Mary's Heights, Fort Wagner, or Lookout Mountain. Now, Earl Hess, the historian, has noted that other historians who studied different wars have tended to give patriotism and ideology more credit than do the few historians of the Civil War who have addressed the issue into how men withstand combat. Now, as the historian of the battle-hardened Left Arm Corps, and as a psychiatrist who's treated and worked with those who've been to war, I've concentrated on the ideologic beliefs of the Union soldiers and sailors and the moral power to which Dr. Shea referred. In 1905, the Survivors Association of the 118th Pennsylvania, the Corn Exchange Regiment, wrote, the Army of the Potomac was the people in arms, filled with youths who had no love for war, but who had left their pleasant homes, pursuits of peace, that the government they loved might not perish. The private soldiers were often as intelligent critics of military movements as their superiors. Now, how accurate were these observations, which were made decades after the war? There was no doubt that the Army of the Potomac and other northern armies were indeed the people in arms, predominantly volunteer. And the Union enlisted men were perceptive evaluators of their officers and how the war was being waged. So certainly what the Pennsylvanians had to say was true. However, as I will discuss, it's debatable whether they had no love for war. It's particularly in light of the collective desire of soldiers throughout history to see the elephant, that marvelous expression for the 19th century, to test one's manhood in the greatest challenge of all. As to motivation, did Northern men really go to war that the government they love might yet perish, were indeed these romantic recollections 40 years later, ascribing a cause to themselves that had not really been their reason for enlisting. Luckily, I've got the Left Arm Corps writing in 1865 and 1866, and I could take a look at what they had to say. Men such as Frederick Platt, who was not yet 17 when he joined the 10th Connecticut in August 1861, he felt he could not sit the war out because he had to fight those who would destroy the best government that ever cast its aegis over its citizens, by those all of whom owed them to the genius of American institutions. 64th Ohio Sergeant Samuel T. Bierbauer, who lost the use of his right arm during 32 months of service, made it clear what the rank and file had risked. Enduring every hardship for $13 a month was nothing to what it was worth. If the cause of liberty had not been at stake, do you suppose the soldiers would have volunteered to pass through all the hardships and damage for that amount if it hadn't been to save our glorious Union? Did not blood flow like water? 40th Illinois Private George W. Akins, who enlisted in 1861, knew exactly the price that was paid and how vital the Union soldier's obligation was to the nation's history. If liberty was worth the blood of our fathers, much more is worth ours, as we had all enjoyed the blessings that we conferred by a free government. But it is enough to know that a country is one inseparable, and we have proved ourselves worthy of our sires. Again, please bear in mind that all these men had been asked for was a handwriting sample. Nobody had asked them what they thought about why they enlisted, what they thought of the Republic, what the Americans felt they owed to a system of government. Yet these common enlisted men who had voluntarily gone to war come from all over the Union, many of them originally from foreign countries, and all of whom had suffered debilitating wounds, independently chose to discuss these very issues in their essay. So rather than employing trite, cliched expressions of patriotism, these men, the Left Arm Corps, demonstrated great understanding of and commitment to the underlying principles of a constitutional republic. One of those men was Rufus Robinson, 121st New York. Let it not be said of us in future years, when historians shall record our deeds, that republic institutions proved a failure. America will now not only be the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, but she will be a fitting example for others to imitate. They knew the cost of that. Sergeant Anthony Beaver, 53rd Pennsylvania, and later in the Veteran Reserve Corps, he spelled out what the soldiers, sailors, and Marines had to overcome to fight whom they deemed in every one of their essays as traitors. And let me make this clear. You hear stories about fraternization between Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers. They were not brothers under the skin. That is a myth. They were fighting for completely different reasons. The United States in 1861 was indeed almost two countries. It was different as to the makeup of the country, the ethnicities that were there, where African Americans were free and were not free, although certainly in the North they were second-class citizens, but they were free for the vast part. The difference in industrialization, the difference in occupations. These were not two armies under the skin that were the same, because they weren't. And one of the things I will point out, that 25% of all white Northern soldiers were born outside the United States. That was not the case with the soldiers in the Confederate States of America. Secondly, there were no religious revivals in the armies of the Union. There were two religious revivals in the armies of the Confederacy. So these were differences between these men. And another difference was not just what they were fighting for, but the changes they underwent during the war and the politicization, the radicalization that the Union soldier, initially all white, and then starting in 1863, African American, is remarkable. And they knew exactly what they were fighting for. An example came from James Smith, 5th Pennsylvania Private. He talked about fighting for light, liberty, truth, justice, integrity, fidelity, and Christianity, rather than to permit slavery, oppression, monarchy, and everything base, vile, and degrading to rule our glorious land of the free and the home of the brave. The Emancipation hadn't arisen on its own, but evolved from events that were coming at breakneck speed and changing circumstances during an expanding war. With the whole world watching, political considerations, foreign and domestic, were of great significance for the United States. Just as important was why white American men were slaughtering each other in numbers that beggared belief. Bear in mind, the carnage of the Civil War was not replicated in any American war before or since the Civil War. If the same numbers of dead would take place now as took place during the Civil War, there'd be 6 million Americans dead in comparable percentage as to the 620,000 who died during the Civil War. So in addition to preserving the Union, what was the value of the Union being preserved if slavery was still intact? The servicemen of the Union, just representative like the Left Arm Corps, showed profound understanding of the principles of Republican democracy, with faith in that system, again, Lincoln's last best hope of earth. And then they started to see something that they didn't know a lot about. They saw slavery up front. And what they saw appalled them. And men, in many cases, predominantly, as Jim McPherson pointed out in his For Cause and Comrades, that most Union soldiers in 1861 were Democrats. Of course, by 1864, most of them were Lincoln Republicans. And that's a vast change. But they started to see what slavery had done to the United States. That was one aspect. They were getting tremendous help from African Americans, enslaved and free. And then the most changing of all, they started fighting alongside African American men. And that was not just life-changing for them, it was galvanizing change for the United States. So what had happened? War tends to enlarge people's understanding and vistas if they survive. Like 5th Ohio Sergeant William Penn Sands. Let's hope that the future may be bright and glorious and equal to the responsibility that rests upon us. That the immortal principles of the Declaration of Independence may be verified, and that we as a nation may put away prejudice, that this glorious land of freedom may ever be the refuge for the oppressed of Europe. Then there was Charles Wickwire, 6th Vermont. He'd been left for dead on the battlefield, spent a month in the notorious Libby prison in Richmond, lost his left arm in the Battle of the Wilderness. So on December 2nd, 1864, he writes from Central Park Hospital, "Though crippled in body, my patriotism is still without a scratch. I voted for President Lincoln and no compromise with traitor in arms, and am for the Union, liberty now and forever, one and inseparable." Of course, quoting Daniel Webster. Believe it or not, Charles Wickwire was not done fighting for the Union because he joined the United States Colored Troops as an officer. Expressing a common sentiment of Northern soldiers was their detestation of the government they were opposing. They detested the Confederate States of America, and they loathed what they felt their foes in butternut and brown and gray were doing, because they were manifestations of rebellion against the system of government they revered. So they were becoming professional soldiers. They were volunteer soldiers. They were citizen soldiers. But they were becoming professional soldiers to rival the finest in the world. Now, before I mention that I questioned what they had said in the Pennsylvania recollections, that they didn't love war. Well, psychiatrist Samuel Bradshaw, James Horner, and psychologist Carol Oldie, in their seminal work, The Love of War, Vietnam and the Traumatized Veteran, they said this: many men do love war. A significant number of men who have gone to war say they would never have avoided the experience. One of them was Michael Mangan, 31 years old in June 1861, when he enlisted in the 6th Wisconsin as a corporal. Again, as I mentioned, an integral part of the famed Iron Brigade. He was a newly commissioned 2nd lieutenant and acting 1st lieutenant when the regiment arrived at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. That day, in front of the railroad cut at the feet of Rufus Dawes, his right ankle was wounded to the extent that the lower leg on his right side was amputated, yet he stayed in the Army After being promoted to first lieutenant, he joined the Veteran Reserve Corps and later was in the regular Army. He identified himself in an autograph book at Central Park Hospital as a member of 1st Regiment, 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Army Corps of what I believe is the best army in the world, the Army of the Potomac. A man he didn't know, Charles Norton II, who served in the 1st Maine Cavalry and the 7th New Hampshire, who lost his right arm at Fort Fisher in January 1865, he sent an entry to the handwriting contest, which was a poem entitled Long Bridge, after the wooden bridge that spanned the Potomac from Washington to Alexandria. He talked about this bridge that across this line rushed the grandest army the world ever saw. So here were two veterans of the Eastern Theater, one several months before Lee's surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, and another several months afterwards, independently using superlatives to describe the Army of the Potomac. Neither one of these men had any military training or experience before they enlisted. They had both sustained debilitating injuries, but what they also had in common was tremendous pride in their military service and the organization in which they had fought. Now, if the Army of the Potomac was indeed superior to any other army on earth, present or past, what would it mean about Mangan, Norton, and their comrades? It meant that American citizen soldiers, forged by war, had become fighting men to rival the finest professional in the world. Now, it's fascinating when you look at their evolution as soldiers, because the regular Army officers of the Union held enlisted recruits, frankly, in contempt. And the soldiers knew that. And what Bell, Earl, and Wiley said in his great book, The Life of Billy Yank, that the volunteers' hostility towards professionals blended with admiration, where as good as the regulars, or some put it better, was deemed one of the highest tributes the volunteers could pay for themselves. So a lot of the volunteers, and I want to make this clear, many of the volunteers did join regular Army units, so they could compare themselves to professional soldiers, and they strove to become their equals and not superiors. And a great example of that was Moseley Hall, who served in the 5th U.S. Artillery. In his essay to the left-hand writing contest, he talked about how he rose to the rank of sergeant, and that in the regular Army, among men who had served from 5 to 20 years. If I never performed any brilliant or daring act, nor did they ever neglect to avoid any duty through fear of hardships or danger. So they were extremely proud of what they had learned, the kind of soldiers they had become, the men with whom they served. And Louis Booz talked about this transforming experience. He firmly believed that military discipline will improve a young man, giving him an experience of hardships, troubles, and sufferings, which he would hardly meet in a life outside the Army. It teaches him not to be troubled about what were previously heavy grievances. That is exactly the findings of psychologists Carol Alden, Michael Levinson, and Avron Spiral III in 1994, when they studied predominantly World War II and Korean War veterans. A significant percentage hadn't been in combat. Almost all these ex-servicemen agreed they had, quote, learned to cope with adversity through being in the military. 5 years after his Civil War service, Booz hadn't changed his feelings at all. As a soldier called upon to give a history of my experience while in the Army, I do so with feelings of pride and wonder at the many trials through which I have passed and which have better enabled me through God's blessings to bear the cross of this life upon coming home to live as a private citizen. One of the things that must be understood when you work with veterans or have a veteran in your family or work alongside veterans, and just knowing what it means to have served, is what the bond that they have is extremely hard to replicate in civilian life. Conrad Dipple, a father of 3 who was drafted in late 1863 at the age of 31, he found in the 37th Wisconsin, quote, many a comrade in the same situation as me. We shared alike in the hardships and vicissitudes of war. This may be considered as a test of loyalty. Anthony Beaver wrote, if there's anything on earth that sanctifies friendship and proves our common brotherhood, it is the struggles, suffering, and the wounds of war. Again, these exemplified modern day findings about the exceptional ties forged among those who served together. The psychiatrist Ted Nadelson observed, the bond which arises early in training becomes stronger in combat and is closer for many soldiers than any relationship they can remember before or since. That is why for many men and women now who are in war, it is not war that creates a problem for them when they come home. It is the absence of war. It is the absence of relationships like this. They search for them in civilian life and generally don't find them. Similarly, the military historians John Keegan and Richard Holmes remarked, the bonds of affection which link men in a good unit are astonishingly powerful. And they gave examples of that in their book. For example, a Vietnam grunt whose squad members would do anything for each other. Living that way was, quote, why we loved and respected each other, we prayed for each other. In his marvelous memoir, World War II Marine writer Eugene Sledge called war brutish, inglorious, a terrible waste, with combat leaving an indelible mark on those who were forced to endure it. However, he also stated that remarkable bravery and mutual devotion of his comrades were the sole redeeming aspects. As they learned efficient ways to kill and attempt to survive the Marine Corps training, Sledge said it also taught us loyalty to each other and love. That esprit de corps sustains us. In the literature of war, the experiential literature of war, the word love comes up time and time again. If you've seen the marvelous film Platoon, written and directed by a decorated Vietnam veteran, Oliver Stone, that film is about love between those men who served in that platoon. As reported by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin, another Marine in a more recent war echoed Sledge's sentiments as Sergeant Terry Pendleton pondered the fate of the last Americans to leave Vietnam. The trust he felt for every one of those men trapped on this roof went deeper than words allowed, to the point of love. Know what he felt went even beyond the word love. Brothers sharing the same beliefs, the same challenges, the same fears together. One word stands out in all these works, love. As for brother, Jonathan Shea reported it's apparently handiest and most frequently spoken representation of attachment between the closest of comrades among those in combat. Union soldiers also use the term, and my experience with veterans matches my fellow psychiatrists' observation and those of others. What I've presented epitomizes what psychiatrists Bradshaw and Horn, who, as I mentioned, and their clinical psychologist partner, Carol Oldie, at the VA in Topeka, what they term the warrior identity and the positive reverberations on the post-war lives of the warrior identity. Basing their marvelous work on their extensive clinical work with PTSD-diagnosed Vietnam vets who've been in combat, in 1991, they suggested there's a continuum of experience, of response to war experience, along which, quote, greater and greater levels of change take place in the soldier. At a far end of the spectrum was the heart of darkness killer, as they called it, while at the opposite end is the soldier who manifests no personality judgment. The vast majority of soldiers developing the warrior identity are in the middle. They cautioned against the assumption that the warrior personality is found only in the middle of the spectrum, as I mentioned. To some extent, the virtues of courage, ability to withstand delayed gratification, and intense comradeship are found throughout the spectrum in response to war. As such characteristics are quite advantageous in civilian pursuits, the force of a positive warrior identity in peacetime is evident in how those who have been under fire view themselves and how they reintegrate into society. This was personified by Union veterans, black and white, who manifests as what we've learned about resilience, post-traumatic growth, the warrior identity sustained and sustaining power, and the keen awareness that their work was hardly finished. As moral injury, PTSD, and suicide risk are all intertwined, these things are vital to be looked at. And so the work that I've done, using material from all wars that Americans have fought in, starting with the Civil War, all the way through the latest wars, the modern wars, and all the insights that we have learned since the Civil War and during the Civil War. The lack of combat-related PTSD, their general mental health, and their stated views, it appears that the left arm corps did not manifest moral injury in relation to their military service. Why? Because they believed in the morality of what they were fighting for, They had not committed atrocities. They had killed, and they didn't talk about the fact they had killed, but they had killed as all soldiers do. But when they came home, they had another war to fight, another moral war. And there's no evidence in the Left Arm Corps and hundreds of thousands of other Union veterans, black and white, that they suffered moral injury. Because what were called thinking bayonets in war, as the Union soldier began to be called, remain thinking bayonets in peace. I'll conclude this talk with what Major Joseph Egoff, yet another member of the Left Arm Corps, said at the dedication of a monument to his regiment, the 126th New York at Gettysburg in 1888. A few survivors of the 126th and 125th meet here tonight to revive the friendships that during the war have been created between these regiments. Many have met today for the first time since they had the privilege of touching shoulders in the bitter struggle for home and country and starry flag. The bond building these two regiments together has been welded today stronger than ever before. Thank you for your attention. I'd be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you so much. We'll give people an opportunity to either raise your hands or you can turn your camera on and ask with your voice for questions. We did have one in the chat that I noticed, which was something that made me I wanted to ask this question too. And it's if there's any way, please list how I can see the poem mentioned about the long bridge across the Potomac and where that came from.
Okay. The Left Arm Corps essays and material is posted on Library of Congress website. So you can look at them there. I spent years curating the collection. My first book that came out was not supposed to be the first book out. In classic publishing tradition, I'm now going to put out the prequel to the book on Reconstruction, because I have a book about the Left Arm Corps starting with the Civil War, actually starting before the Civil War. And I'll be including much of this in my book. But you can look at the essays. They're in PDF, and they're on the Library of Congress website. Public domain. That's the beauty of stuff from the Library of Congress and National Archives.
This is Teff Smith. I had a question as to, in your reading of these various things, did any of these people express disappointment over what was happening in Reconstruction?
That's what my book is about. Don't forget, these essays only were from mid-1865 to January 1866. What I did by following these men until the last man died in 1937. By the way, that's a great question. That's why I spent literally 15 years studying this cohort. I tracked down all of them to find out what they did during Reconstruction. They were remarkable in what they did during Reconstruction. And they were bitterly disappointed, as were people like Ambrose Bierce and other Union veterans, about the failure of Reconstruction, because they felt the failure of Reconstruction meant that what they had fought for, I'm not going to say was meaningless, because it wasn't, but they knew how important it was to continue the fight, which they did. So I pointed towards my book. That is exactly the question I tried to answer, which, by the way, is contradictory to what has been the popular teaching by historians, that Union veterans were not interested in Reconstruction and did not have that, which, quite frankly, I could not believe, because in my work with veterans, I know how politically active they are. Certainly my work with Vietnam veterans. And if you ever want a great example, those of us who remember John Kerry's testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1971, the famous statement, "Who wants to be the last man to die for a mistake?" as one of the founders of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. There was a whole tradition of this. And by the way, modern veterans acknowledge the example shown by Union veterans, black and white, after the Civil War. So they knew. So when that great question that you asked, Mrs. Smith, was exactly what I tried to answer in my book.
Okay, well, that's what I was interested in. I've been reading a lot about Reconstruction lately. And one of the questions was, as I'm sure you focused upon, was that there was consideration by Grant for running for a third term. And then he equivocated and didn't, and whether that might have made a difference from your perspective in what happened in Reconstruction.
I tell you what, please get the book. My viewpoint is, and by the way, my book doesn't end with Reconstruction. My book ends in 1913.
Right.
Because one of the things that has not been written about is the impact of Reconstruction in places that technically were not covered by Reconstruction, such as northern states that were not border states.
Right.
And there was a tremendous impact. Places like Ohio, schools started to be desegregated in a state that had black codes, which never would have happened without Reconstruction. That's one aspect. Secondly, my focus is very different than most of the other books on Reconstruction because my focus are the veterans themselves, what they thought, why they were so politically active. I have an entire chapter on the Lee statue that was in the capital of the United States up until 2 years ago. I've got 3 chapters on the Grand Army of the Republic, the only national organization to refuse to draw a color line. 5 years before Plessy versus Ferguson established Jim Crow as the federal law of the land and set back civil rights for 50 years. So
Right.
Again, the question you're asking.
That's a great fact. I was not aware of the Grand Army of the Republic. That's a great fact.
Yeah, and and one thing people have asked me, well, how can you don't know that every Union veteran? Well, obviously, there were over 2.5 million of them, but 1/3 of them were members of the Grand Army. I have a representative sample, which I've got, and by the way, my work is not just about the Left Arm Corps, because I look at all veterans in toto, and again, particularly African-American veterans, who were tremendously politically active, and they were leaders in their community. They were special targets of the Klan, because nothing was more frightening than an African-American who would not step off the street when a white person walked, as they were expected to do, and who had been to war and had nothing to fear from the Klan in that aspect. That's why Union veterans themselves were targets in uniform during Reconstruction, because that fear, and by the way, this is exactly what we see with men and women who have been to war. They have nothing to prove to anybody. And that warrior identity, which is so powerful, is seen, and I guess you can hear the intensity with which I say this. Veterans do, for the most part, beautifully in civilian life. They're successful in civilian life. Take a look at members of Congress. Tammy Duckworth is a great example of that. So John Kerry's still in service. He's close to 80. He's still serving the United States. I mentioned Max Cleland. There's a reason why that is. There's a reason why there's an acceptance of that. And veterans themselves bitterly resent the image that is portrayed of veterans as damaged goods. They're not damaged goods. And there are 2, I don't know if you're aware, there are 2 longitudinal studies of Vietnam vets that are still being carried out for decades. They've been one of the most successful veterans groups in American history. And is that really the image we have of the Vietnam veterans based on Hollywood? In many of the films, they're portrayed very differently, except for films like Platoon, which, again, written and directed by a veteran himself. And everything in there happened to Stone. He talks about that. And, so these things are very important. And as someone who's worked for the VA, which, by the way, was marvelous, you get to know things that most people don't know because they share them with you, because you become part of the milieu. So I feel very honored. And if you take a look at the acknowledgement in my book, that was my acknowledgement, was to the men and women who've taught me so much in the years I've worked with them, because of the things they've shared with me. And by the way, when I do lectures, they help me burnish the material. Other questions? These are great questions.
Well, it looks like we have Fritz Edler. You've got your hand raised.
Yeah, well, I'm just bowled over by what an impressive presentation this is, and I'm looking forward to looking at your book. And you actually touched on one of the questions I was going to ask, which had to do with the Grand Army of the Republic. Because what you've said is an important a rebuttal of a lot of the revisionist history of the last 100 years, which I think is really important even for the modern moment. But so you've said that you see this evidence and you present this evidence of the one more war to fight after the war. What are their vehicles? How? I mean, obviously the GAR was an important organization. I actually am in the Sons of Union Veterans, which is the successor organization. And
Right.
I have to say, the Sons of Union Veterans needs a fight around the question of this history, which it is largely lost. I mean, that people may disagree with me on that, but anyway, I want to know, in addition to the GAR, are there others? Are there other things you could point to?
Sure. And again, I'd be delighted to talk with your organization about it, because you're right, it is lost. The Grand Army was a manifestation of other things they were doing. I devote almost an entire chapter to the Freedmen's Bureau, a fascinating topic, which was manned by Union veterans, because the Freedmen's Bureau was a military operation. And by the way, a high percentage of the Left Arm Corps served in the Freedmen's Bureau. Don't forget, there's only 268 men, and there were like 7 people who served in the Freedmen's Bureau. I mean, that's remarkable. And serving the Freedmen's Bureau was a commitment to that second war. The Grand Army, as you know, was technically apolitical, but everybody knew they were advocating for progressive Republican ideals, which they did. They were a solid voting bloc. When they refused to draw a color line, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book, was an absolute statement that drew back to what had happened during the war, because they saw African-American men as men for the first time. And this has happened in every war. There's a great quote from Carmelantes, the Vietnam veteran writer, who talked about when he went back to his reunion at Harvard and discovered that he'd experienced something none of them had experienced, because he'd gone to war. And he had experience with African-American fellow soldiers that other people didn't have. And he talked about how the roots of the civil rights movement were unacknowledged in what happened during Nam, that people learned about each other. Again, that's why I love Platoon, because that unit in Platoon is so diverse. And again, if you haven't seen the film, the relationship in the film that is the most moving is between Charlie Sheen and Keith David, an inner city African American and a guy who dropped out of college based on Stone himself. And the most amazing scene in the film is when King gets his orders, if you know the scene, and Sheen walks him out of the jungle. You know, it's 10 days in a wake up. It is so beautiful, because these men would never have met during civilian life, and these were brothers for life. And that's portrayed. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. That's exactly what happened in the Civil War. And that has been unacknowledged. I can't explain why it's been unacknowledged, but I found abundant evidence of it. I mean, this is stuff I found. And the other thing that was very exciting, which I hope that you'll find interesting, are the soldier conventions in 1866 and 1868. One of them, the ones associated with the 14th Amendment, and the second associated with the 15th Amendment. Those were huge changes. Grant called the ratification of the 15th Amendment the most important event in American history. And of course, that was his first administration in terms of that. So these things were out there. And I couldn't agree with you more that this has impact right now as to how we look at American history, how it's taught. The fact that we're standing on the shoulders of people who came before us. You know, all these movements that are so important now for rights and for equity, it didn't start with us. It started with many of these men and women in the 1860s. And I'm hoping that in any small part I'm doing, I'm making this clear. And it didn't stop in the 1860s or the 1870s. Other questions?
I have a question. And I'll give folks another opportunity to think of one of their own. But hearing you speak, Dr. Goldman, and thinking about the work that you've done professionally with psychiatry and working directly with veterans, you are the perfect person to write this book. And I'm just curious, also knowing your involvement and your affinity for Abraham Lincoln, where did that start? Where did sort of the passion for the Civil War and or Lincoln, where did that start for you?
When I was a kid, first time I went to Gettysburg, I was 7 years old. My father, may he rest in peace, was a tremendous, had tremendous interest in history. Was a veteran himself. He served in the Korean War as a physician. I didn't realize the impact of coming of age during the Vietnam era would have on my career in life. Mm. It's clear to me now that one of the reasons why I became a psychiatrist was the Vietnam War and wanting to work with veterans. And those of you who either know or work with Vietnam veterans know how awesome they are, how remarkable they are. And it has been an absolute privilege to work with them and with other veterans groups. Working with the VA was a dream. I spent most of my residency working with the VA and afterwards. So these books I'm writing now are a culmination of the work I've done and continue to do. And I appreciate what you're saying, Callie, because I think it is a different perspective. Again, my training is not history. History buff, yes, but I'm not a trained historian. I've got training in other fields. And there's a whole literature out there that the historians are not either privy to or would not have the extent of expertise that I could bring to it, quite frankly, because there is a difference between having worked with veterans and certainly having worked with veterans as a psychiatrist. And our mutual friend Rod Ross asked me this at the archives about looking at the archives records. Again, they're medical records. And so when I looked at the records and was able to take a look at the entire cohort, and by the way, the third book is about what happened to the cohort for the rest of their lives, and also an examination of looking for any cases of PTSD. There's such good material out there. And one of the things I've leaned heavily on are the marvelous newspaper archives that are out there. And again, what I use in all of my books and all of my research, I always like to use contemporaneous material. I don't like recollections. I don't like regimental histories for the most part because they're from decades later. I want to know what was going on at the time. And again, apropos of the question you asked about Grant's administration, I got some great stuff, obviously, about the two administration, what went on during Reconstruction, because the newspapers of the times were really good because that was the way people communicated. So they published verbatim speeches, new bills that were being passed. And you had the National Tribune, which was a Union veteran-centric newspaper, which was marvelous and which covered racial issues, by the way, also indicative of their interest in it. And that was a great resource. All this is on the website of the Library of Congress, on the Chronicling America, and they keep adding to it. So you don't have to go to the hand crank machines anymore to use the newspaper archives. And that is a tremendous advantage. But you also have to know how to use them, and to take a look at the whole panoply of what you have available there.
Well, we are out of time for this evening, and I just want to say thank you so much. I took many notes, one of which I starred 3 times, and that was a reminder to myself to go watch Platoon, which I have never seen, and I will do that this weekend. But thank you so much, Dr. Goldman. It has really been a pleasure to welcome you and to see so many wonderful faces here tonight with so many great questions. So
can I say one last thing?
Sure, please.
Okay. I do have a brand new website. You can email me with comments or questions. It's stephenagoldmanmd.com. And I'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining. We hope to see you at the Cottage or for another scholar session sometime soon.
It'll be my pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.